All right, everybody, get ready, because today we are doing a deep dive into Zonya. And it's a fascinating story.
It is.
And a lot of you have asked us to cover it, and we dove deep into the research. We read reports, we read articles, we looked at economic data,
Hmm.
and what we found is really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's a country, most folks probably haven't even heard of, but it's kind of bucking the trend, becoming this like beacon of hope and economic success too, and in a region, that's often known for conflict and instability.
It
So,
really is. We're talking about a place that went from war-torn and basically impoverished to like a model for development, even like surpassing some well-established economies. It's
okay.
incredible. So how they do it? Well, that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We're going to look at Zonya, from all angles, its history, its politics, but most importantly, how it's kind of defying the odds to become this success story.
Right. And to kind of set the stage, picture this volcanic mountains, these huge savannas, and beautiful lakes. That's Zonia.
It's picturesque.
It is.
Yeah.
And about 80% of the population are the Zoni people, so there's a strong cultural core there. But their journey to becoming a nation, oh, it was anything but easy.
Yeah, they got their independence from Emrystari back in '91, but it wasn't exactly a peaceful transition, was it?
Right, yeah. The relationship with Mon is, it's complicated. It goes all the way back to Emrystari's colonial policies, which kind of emphasized Zoni dominance that created these lasting ethnic divisions, setting the stage for conflict, really.
It's like they planted the seeds for future problems.
Hmm.
Emrystari in particular had this strategy of divide and rule.
Okay.
They introduced these identity cards that basically restricted certain tribes to specific areas and types of jobs.
Wow.
It was a deliberate attempt to create divisions within the population
Hmm.
and prevent any kind of unified resistance to their rule.
Yeah, the classic colonial tactic, pit one group against the other so you can maintain control.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a recipe for trouble down the road.
And then fast forward to the Zonyan Revolution, 1989. That wasn't just some small protest. Things got really intense.
Absolutely. The Maoni even occupied the Zonian parliament. Can you imagine? It was pure chaos. And that led to this really fragile partition in 91 when Zonya finally got its independence. But Mon, they never really accepted it.
So even after independence, they're dealing with this hostile neighbor. What did that look like? What was happening on the ground?
Well, for the next 15 years, Mon basically used all sorts of tactics to undermine Zonya. Airspace violations, disrupting trade, even propaganda campaigns. It was constant pressure.
Real pressure cooker. And then, of course, you have the Kokaka hydroelectric dam incident in 2006. That seems like a major turning point, right?
Yeah, in 2006, Mon decided to occupy the dam. And it was a huge problem for Zonya. Like, imagine all of a sudden, most of your power supply is gone. Factories can't run, farms can't irrigate their crops.
Wow, a whole country basically on hold.
Yeah, it was a desperate situation. Zonya, well, they retaliated by bombing an oil field in Mon, and, things spiraled pretty quickly after that.
Okay, so now we've got a full-blown conflict brewing, and that's when MATO, the Marquis and Alcohol Treaty Organization, steps in. Now, as I understand it, MATO is mostly focused on protecting their economic interests in the region, especially, anything that has to do with the alcohol trade. So why would they get involved in this conflict?
Well, I mean, Zonya was, falling apart. And that instability, it was threatening to disrupt trade routes that were super important to MATO and its members. So they stepped in and gave Zonya a lot of military and financial aid. It was really MATO that helped them push back Maon's forces.
So MATO is kind of like this powerful mediator stepping in to protect its own interests, but also, I guess, to try and stabilize the region.
Yeah, you could say that.
But it wasn't without controversy, was it?
Oh, no, not at all. A lot of people criticized MATO. They said that, they were overstepping their boundaries, that they were interfering in, the affairs of a sovereign nation.
Right.
Some people even said that their only real interest was protecting their economic interests, not like actually upholding peace or anything like that.
Right. So you have accusations of ulterior motives on one side and the need to prevent a bigger conflict on the other. It's complicated.
It really is.
But eventually, this all led to the Tumbaka Peace Accord in 2007. Did that finally settle things between Zonya and Mon?
Well, it did create a ceasefire, and it set up, a way for them to negotiate. But it didn't really truly fix things. Even now, Mon still refuses to say that Zonya is an independent nation.
Wow. So even after all of that, Zonya's left to rebuild. War-torn, displaced people, an uncertain future. What a tough starting point.
It was, but that's what makes their turnaround so remarkable, and that's where figures like Solomon Butera and Bertram Mokoka come in. Mokoka, he was a general who became president. They're key to understanding how Zonya went from this bleak outlook to, well, an economic success story.
All right, so let's dig into that turnaround. How did these leaders transform Zonya? Was it like a personality thing, strategic brilliance, or
Mm.
something else entirely?
Well, Makoka's whole approach, it's been a real study in contrasts. Like, on the one hand, he implemented some pretty bold economic reforms,
Hmm.
reforms aimed at attracting foreign investment, streamlining the bureaucracy, and really going after corruption.
Sounds like he was trying to hit the ground running.
He was. And the result was some serious economic growth. It actually pushed Zonya way up in the rankings for things like ease of doing business.
So at least on paper, it looks like he was making some smart moves economically. But what about this whole authoritarianism thing? What were the red flags? What actions going to set off those alarm bells?
Well, for one thing, he decided to extend his own presidential term.
Oh,
Yeah, and that raised a lot of eyebrows about how committed he actually was to, democratic norms.
right, playing by the rules.
He was also accused of cracking down on political dissent, basically silencing any opposition and really tightening his control over key institutions.
So consolidating his power.
Yeah, and his critics, they argue that even if his intentions were good,
Yeah.
even if he was genuinely trying to maintain stability and drive progress, you can't just erode democratic principles and create a climate of fear.
Right, the ends don't justify the means. So it sounds like we've got a classic case of a leader achieving some tangible progress, but at what cost?
It's such a tough question to wrestle with, right? Like, how do we balance economic achievements with concerns about individual freedoms and liberties?
It's really worth taking a closer look at Mokoka's economic strategies because they're a big part of why he's so popular, but also why people are nervous about his rule. Yeah, for sure. You mentioned earlier that he managed to attract foreign investment. He cut through all the bureaucratic red tape and really took aim at corruption. I mean, those sound like classic development strategies, but what do they actually look like in action in Zonya?
One of the things that Mokoka did that was really interesting was he focused on specific sectors that aligned with Zonya's long-term goals.
Oh, so it wasn't just a free-for-all for any investor who wanted
No,
to.
no, not at all. He was very strategic about it. He prioritized things like renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. It's a more nuanced approach than you often see in developing countries. A lot of them just want those quick economic wins.
Yeah, instant gratification. So he was playing the long game, thinking about building a more resilient and diversified economy. That
Wow.
does sound promising, but did it actually work?
It's been a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest.
As it always is.
Zonya has definitely seen significant growth in those sectors. They've attracted companies that are interested in ethical and sustainable practices.
So that's a plus.
It is. But there are some critics who say that focusing so intently on those specific industries comes at a cost. They argue that it might actually limit Zonya's economic diversification in the long run.
What about the crackdown on corruption, though? Our sources, they all highlight that Zonya's ranking in global corruption indices has improved dramatically since Mokoka took office.
That's true. It's one of his most celebrated achievements, for sure. He basically implemented a zero-tolerance policy for corruption. He strengthened all the anti-corruption institutions and increased transparency in how the government does business.
And that's a big deal for investors, right?
Huge. It gave Zonya this reputation as one of the least corrupt countries in the region, which obviously attracted investors who valued a level playing field.
Makes sense. But forgive me if I'm a little skeptical. Is it all just smoke and mirrors? I mean, corruption is notoriously difficult to stamp out completely.
You're right to be cautious. It's really hard to know for sure. While there's no doubt that Mokoka's efforts have had a positive impact, some critics argue that the focus on high-level corruption might actually be overshadowing the smaller-scale bribery and favoritism that still affects ordinary citizens.
So it's like catching the big fish, but the little guy is still swimming around in murky waters.
Yeah, kind of.
And what about this concern that the anti-corruption drive is actually being used to silence Mokoka's political opponents?
That's a serious accusation, and it's a tough one to prove definitively. But there have been a number of cases where anti-corruption investigations have targeted individuals who were openly critical of Mokoka's government.
So it does raise some red flags.
It does. It makes you wonder about selective enforcement.
So it's possible that this fight against corruption, while being, admirable in principle, might actually be serving two purposes: cleaning up the economy and also conveniently consolidating Mokoka's own political power.
Exactly. And that's what makes Mokoka such a complex and controversial figure. He's definitely delivered undeniable economic progress, but the methods he's used have raised some serious questions about whether he's truly committed to democratic values.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The 2006 conflict, Mado's involvement, those incredible national plans, and of course Bertram Makoka's leadership. But even with all that progress, Zonya still has some pretty big challenges ahead of it, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, they've come a long way, but there are still some things, some pretty big things that could derail their progress.
Like what? What are some of the biggest hurdles they're still facing?
Well, for one, poverty.
Hmm.
Zonya has done a pretty good job of, reducing poverty overall, but it's not equal everywhere.
Right, it's not like everyone's benefiting from this economic boom equally.
Exactly. There are some areas, especially in the countryside, that are still really struggling. They haven't seen the same kind of development as the cities. They don't have the same access to, good infrastructure, education, job opportunities.
So you've got like these pockets of extreme poverty, even while the rest of the country is, seeing this incredible growth.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's a problem because if that gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing, it could lead to some serious instability. People get resentful. Things can get pretty volatile.
That makes sense. It's like you need to make sure that everyone's benefiting from economic growth,
Yeah.
not just a select few.
Exactly. And then there's, corruption.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that.
Yeah, Zanya's made some progress in fighting corruption, but it's still an issue. And their legal system, it's gotten better, but it's still pretty slow and inefficient.
Ah, so that could be discouraging for like businesses and investors.
Oh, absolutely. If you can't rely on the courts to be fair and efficient, it makes it really risky to invest or do business in that country.
Okay, so we've got these internal challenges, poverty, corruption, issues with the legal system.
Mhm.
What about external challenges? Like I know Zonia is still pretty reliant on foreign aid and investment. Could that be a problem?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's great that they're getting this support, but it can also create, dependencies. If you're always relying on other countries for money and resources, it can be hard to make your own decisions.
Right, like you're always beholden to someone else's interests.
Exactly. So for Zonya to be truly successful in the long term, they need to find ways to diversify their economy, build up their own industries, so they're not so reliant on outsiders.
So they're walking this tightrope, trying to benefit from globalization and foreign investment without, giving up too much control.
It's a tough position to be in.
It is. So what do you think? Can Zonia overcome all of these challenges? Can they really become a middle-income country by 2040 like they're hoping?
I mean, it's definitely possible. They've already shown that they're resilient, they're adaptable, but they have to keep doing the right things. Keep fighting corruption, keep investing in their people, keep building a strong, stable government.
Right. It's like they've laid the groundwork, but now they have to, like, keep building on it.
Exactly.
Well, this has been fascinating. For our listener who wanted to know more about Zonya, what would you say is the main takeaway from all this?
I think the biggest lesson here is that, development is complicated. It's not always a straight line from point A to point B. There are setbacks. There are unexpected challenges.
Yeah.
And even when you make progress, there's always more work to do.
Yeah. And I think it also shows like how important it is to look at the whole picture. You can't just focus on economic growth. You have to think about social equity, political freedom, all of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's all connected.
It really is. Well, thanks for walking us through all of this. It's been a truly enlightening deep dive. And for everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different topic. Until then, keep exploring.